Picture this. You are Margot, a young bride of just 15 winters, standing in the doorway of a cold stone cottage in the autumn of 1347. Outside, the night air smells of damp leaves and wood smoke. Inside, the warmth of the fire is thick with the scent of wet wool, sweat, and smoke-blackened beams. The rushes under your bare feet whisper and crackle as you take each small, reluctant step toward the marriage bed. Your new husband, Henrik, is nearly twice your age, his beard peppered with gray, his hands worn into leather from years of labor. He was not chosen for love, nor even for his gentleness, but for the 3 pigs and half-acre of barley he offered your father. Your hands clutched the coarse woolen shift your mother stitched for this very night, the same shift she wore when she stood trembling before your father and her mother before her. Through the thin timber walls, muffled voices rise and fall. Henrik's friends and cousins, drunk on ale, beating pots, and laughing in the darkness. Their crude encouragements reach you like blows, reminding you of what is expected. They will not leave until they hear proof. Henrik steps closer, candlelight flickering over the sharp planes of his weathered face. His shadow leaps on the wall behind him, too large, too close. His fingers, rough, cracked, smelling faintly of iron, reach for the leather cord at your throat. The knot holds the amulet your mother pressed into your palm earlier, a scrap of bone carved with a symbol she swore would protect your woman's spirit. You wonder if such things can guard you against what is to come. This will not be a night of love. It will be a night of obligation, of custom, of survival. Medieval intimacy was shaped not by tenderness, but by superstition, religious terror, and the relentless machinery of social expectation. A wife was property, her body a vessel for lineage and labor, and in this world, what happened in the marriage bed was never truly private. The church preached that every union was under the watchful eye of God and the judgment of men. Neighbors and kin believed they had a right to witness the moment a marriage became real, sometimes literally listening at the door for the sounds of consummation. It was not enough that a man and woman stand before the priest. The seal of marriage required the spilling of blood and the breaking of flesh. You know this because your mother told you in whispers when the 2 of you knelt by the hearth weeks ago, hands busy plucking geese for the feast. She spoke not of love or joy, but of rules. What days you must refuse him, how to lie still to avoid temptation, and how the wrong position could send your soul to eternal fire. Now, as Henrik leans in and the shouts outside grow louder, you feel the weight of these teachings pressing down as tangibly as the heavy wool blankets on the bed. You are not just Margot tonight. You are the living embodiment of your family's honor, the vessel of your village's gossip, the object of the church's scrutiny. The candle wavers, the air feels close and thick, and as his shadow merges with yours on the wall, you understand. This is not simply a wedding night. This is the battlefield where flesh and faith will collide, where even the smallest gasp or hesitation will be measured, remembered, and possibly judged for the rest of your days. In Margot's world, the wedding night did not begin with privacy, whispers, or soft embraces. It began as a public spectacle. The bedding ceremony was not merely symbolic. It was a sanctioned, even celebrated, intrusion into the most intimate threshold of a couple's life. In the dim firelight of the hall, guests, family, neighbors, sometimes even local officials would rise from the feast table when the time came. The air was thick with the smell of roast meat and spilt ale, voices hoarse from singing and shouting. The newlyweds were taken by the hands, or sometimes quite literally lifted from their seats, and paraded toward the chamber where they would lie together for the first time. The bride's cheeks would burn, whether from wine or shame, as Bodhi songs rang out. The lyrics were blunt, unvarnished, often obscene. In some regions of France, the crowd chanted rhymes, urging the groom to plant his seed deep before dawn. In certain English villages, the chants were even more graphic, peppered with animal metaphors. If Margot dared glance up at Henrik during this raucous procession, she would see him grinning uncomfortably, perhaps playing the part expected of him, though no man could entirely ignore the weight of so many eyes. Once in the chamber, the ritual could turn rough. It was not uncommon for guests, often the closest male friends of the groom, to help prepare the couple. Cloaks were pulled from shoulders, boots tugged off, belts loosened. In some traditions, the bride's gown was unfastened by female relatives, while the men undressed the groom, all the while trading jokes and suggestive barbs. The implication was clear. The marriage was not solely the couple's business, it was the community's investment. This communal involvement had a practical root. In societies where lineage, inheritance, and land rights were fragile, proving a marriage's consummation was proof of its legitimacy. But it also carried an undercurrent of control. The young couple entered married life already reminded that their bodies were not entirely their own. When the couple was finally left alone, the guests did not stray far. Many remained just outside the door, straining for the sounds that would confirm the act. The creak of the bed frame, the muffled cry, the sigh or gasp that might signify completion. In some regions, this waiting crowd would not disperse until they were satisfied that the union had been sealed. The proof was sometimes tangible. The blood-stained sheet, believed to be evidence of the bride's intact virginity, might be displayed to the gathered witnesses the next morning. In noble households, It could be paraded through the hall alongside the breakfast feast, accompanied by knowing laughter and congratulations. In poorer villages, the sheet might simply be shown to the bride's female kin, but the absence of that proof could be disastrous. Regional customs varied. In parts of Scandinavia, the bedding was gentler, marked by songs that celebrated fertility and prosperity rather than sexual conquest. In some alpine villages, the couple's bed was strewn with grain or hops, symbols of fecundity, before they were allowed to lie in it. But in much of Western Europe, the line between celebration and humiliation was razor-thin. For Margot, the laughter outside her door was not warm. It was sharp, edged with the knowledge that she had been traded, inspected, and would soon be judged. She knew that if she failed to produce the expected signs, if her body did not bleed, if her husband did not leave the chamber satisfied, she could face suspicion, public disgrace, even the annulment of the marriage. In this way, the bedding ceremony was less about blessing the marriage, and more about binding the bride and groom to the expectations of their society. Privacy, in such a world, was not a right but a rare and fragile gift. And on this night, Margot possessed none of it. The door had barely closed when Margot's thoughts shifted from the drunken voices outside to the rules that had been drummed into her since childhood. The church, that great, unblinking authority, had clear instructions about what could and could not happen between a husband and wife. To the clergy, the marriage bed was not a playground of passion. It was a narrow, perilous path bordered by sign on all sides. From the pulpit, priests quoted St. Augustine, who warned that pleasure in the act was dangerous. Even within marriage, desire was a flame that could burn away the soul's purity, and so even lawful intimacy was to be approached with caution, discipline, and above all, the right intention, procreation. Margot remembered sitting in the back pew, hands folded, as Father Guillaume declared that spouses must never meet in bed as beasts do, but with modesty, prayer, and self-control. Certain days were forbidden altogether: Sundays, feast days, Fridays, in honor of Christ's Passion, the entire 40 days of Lent, and the weeks before Christmas. To ignore these restrictions was to risk eternal damnation, and, perhaps worse, in Margot's mind, public shame if word reached the wrong ears. There were rules about positions, too. The missionary position, the man above, the woman below, was considered the only lawful form, for it was seen as the natural order of creation. Any deviation was whispered about as perverse, a step toward corruption. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas even wrote in chilling detail about such sins against nature, categorizing them with the same severity as adultery. Even within these rules, the church wove layers of guilt. If pleasure came too quickly, if a woman enjoyed it too much, if a man sought the act without pure intent, these were spiritual stains that required confession. Some manuals for confessors in the 14th century listed dozens of possible marital sins, from excessive touching to speaking certain words in bed. For a young bride like Margot, such teachings were not abstract theology. They were a constant presence, the invisible eyes in the room, the weight of centuries of doctrine pressing down with each heartbeat. She knew that if she failed to please her husband, she might lose his favor. But if she pleased him too much, she risked offending God. Henrik, too, carried these burdens. While the village might wink at male indiscretions, the church did not. Confessors warned men not to seek pleasure for its own sake, to keep their minds fixed on the duty of planting seed, not indulging in lust. Even the timing of the act could invite suspicion. Intercourse during daylight was frowned upon, as was speaking too much during it. So, as Margot sat on the edge of the straw mattress, candlelight trembling on the wall, she understood the strange battlefield ahead. This was not simply her husband versus her will. It was desire versus doctrine, body versus soul, human need versus the unyielding lattice of rules. In this world, sin was not something you stumbled into on dark streets or in alehouses. It could be committed in silence, under blankets, between the same two people who had just stood before the altar and promised each other before God. And as Margot lay back, she realized with a shiver, the church was here, too, in this room, unseen but watching. For Margot, the weight of the wedding bed was more than the heat of Henrik's body beside her. It was the crushing value of something she could never regain. Her virginity, her world, maidenhood was not just a personal state. It was currency. It was proof of her family's honor, a guarantee of her husband's lineage, and a bargaining chip in the complex marketplace of alliances and dowries. To arrive at marriage without it was to enter a contract already broken. The proof, however, was as fragile as it was cruel. Many believed that a bride's virginity could be proven by the presence of blood on the sheets after consummation. This belief ignored nature's variability. Some women bled little or not at all, while others might be injured in ways mistaken for chastity. Yet the stain carried enormous weight. In noble houses, it could be paraded through the hall the next morning, a white sheet spotted with red like a sacred relic, drawing cheers, toasts, and lewd congratulations. In rural villages, it might be shown discreetly to older female relatives, but if absent, suspicion spread quickly, and suspicion could be deadly. In France, England, and parts of the German states, a husband who accused his wife of not being a virgin could bring the matter to court. The proceedings were humiliating. The woman examined by midwives, her past combed through by witnesses. If found guilty of deception, she could be cast out, her dowry forfeited, her family's reputation irreparably stained. In some cases, the marriage could be annulled entirely, sending her back to her parents in disgrace. The obsession with purity extended far beyond the wedding night. A woman's worth was measured not only by her behavior, but by the behavior others believed she had engaged in. Gossip could ruin her as surely as any crime. A flirtatious laugh at a market stall, a walk home taken with the wrong man, even a rumor whispered by a jealous neighbor, all could plant seeds of doubt. Margot had been schooled in this vigilance since girlhood. She remembered her mother warning her that a woman's virtue is like a fine glass. Once cracked, never whole again. She had learned to keep her eyes lowered in the presence of men, to avoid being alone in a room with anyone but family, to move through the world as if every step were being watched. Henrik, for his part, had been raised to see virginity as something owed to him, part of the dowry, alongside land or coin. Whether he valued it personally was irrelevant. The culture demanded that he guard his honor by guarding hers. A man who married a spoiled bride was seen as weak or foolish. His manhood diminished in the eyes of his peers. This was why the bedding ceremony carried such tension. It was not only the beginning of intimacy, it was the trial, the proof, the first public judgment of their union. And Margot, lying in the half-dark with Henrik's breath warm against her cheek, knew that by morning her life could be entirely secure, or utterly shattered. For in the cold mathematics of medieval society, purity was not about truth, it was about perception, and perception was the one thing Margot could not control.
In the medieval world, desire could be dangerous, not only for the soul, as the church preached, but for the marriage itself. A union could be made or unmade based on how a husband and wife behaved in the bed they shared. If a husband claimed his wife was frigid, unwilling, or unable to perform the marital act, he could petition for annulment. In the eyes of the church, a marriage was not truly binding until it was consummated. Without that, the vows were like a candle never lit, a form without flame. Conversely, too much passion could also raise suspicion. A woman who seemed eager, who responded with enthusiasm, might be accused of prior experience, proof, in a husband's mind, that she was no virgin at all. The same logic applied to men. A groom who performed too well might be accused of having learned those skills elsewhere. What should have been a private joy became an open field for accusation. In the courts of Europe, these disputes were not rare. Records from the ecclesiastical courts of Paris, York, and Bologna tell of cases where husbands claimed their wives were barren, or that they had never been able to consummate the marriage because the woman shrank away in fear or pain. Others alleged impotence, sometimes genuine, sometimes invented as a way to escape an undesirable match. The process of proving or disproving such claims could be brutally invasive. In extreme cases, couples were ordered to attempt consummation under the watch of midwives or even clerics, the witnesses stationed in an adjoining room, listening, waiting for signs that the act had taken place. There were also the infamous virilitous tests. If a man was accused of impotence, he might be required to demonstrate arousal before a panel of examiners, a grotesque and humiliating spectacle that could decide the fate of estates, alliances, and fortunes. Even in ordinary village life, such judgments could ripple far beyond the couple involved. If an annulment was granted on the grounds of non-consummation, the woman was considered unmarriageable unless she could prove the fault lay entirely with the man. Families might feud for years over such accusations, the stain lingering across generations. For Margot, the knowledge of these possibilities sat like a stone in her stomach. She had heard of a girl from a nearby hamlet, whose husband claimed she was too tight and fearful for the act to succeed. The church dissolved the marriage, and her parents were forced to return the dowry. The girl never wed again. Here, the body was not only a vessel for life, it was legal evidence, a thing to be examined, questioned, doubted. And passion, that spark of human heat, was not a safe refuge, but a double-edged blade. Too little, and the marriage might be declared void. Too much, and it might be proof of guilt. In this world, love was not the currency of marriage. flesh was. And every gesture, every gasp, every silence could be called into question. For all the weight the church placed on marital duty, it also hemmed that duty in with a bewildering lattice of prohibitions. Sex was allowed, yes, but only in the narrowest corridors of time, position, and purpose. First came the calendar bans. Entire seasons were cordoned off. The 40 days of Lent, the 4 weeks of Advent, the feasts of major saints. The eve of receiving communion, Fridays in memory of the crucifixion, and, for some particularly strict households, even Sundays, the Lord's Day. If you counted them up, more than a third of the year was officially off limits. Then there were the ritual bans. Sex during daylight hours was frowned upon as shameless. Loud noises, laughter, or even speaking during the act were discouraged. Intimacy was supposed to be silent, modest, almost penitential. Theologians wrote that couples should prepare themselves with prayer, lest lust overwhelm the holy duty of procreation. Beyond the when came the how. The missionary position, man above, woman below, was considered the only lawful form, because it imitated what was believed to be natural in animals. Any variation was lumped into the chilling category of sins against nature. Thomas Aquinas ranked these alongside acts like adultery and sodomy in their severity. Touching immodest parts outside of the marital act was condemned. So was kissing in a way that might lead to lust without the aim of conception. And then there was the long shadow of superstition. In rural villages, some believed that sex during certain phases of the moon could cause deformities in children, or that certain positions might result in sickness or misfortune. There were whispered warnings that if a man lay with his wife too soon after childbirth, the milk in her breasts could sour, harming the baby. Of course, not everyone obeyed. Behind closed doors, couples carved out small rebellions. Some ignored the bans altogether, relying on secrecy and the trust of their spouse. Others invented coded excuses to slip past them, claiming, for example, that their act was to heal the body rather than to satisfy lust. Confessors' manuals even reveal that priests sometimes advised couples to do what they must, but be discreet in confession, speaking in vague terms so as not to scandalize. Still, the fear was real. To be caught, even in rumor, could mean public penance, kneeling before the congregation in a plain shift, or worse, enduring the whispered judgment of neighbors who would never forget. Margot, lying beside Henrik in the pale light of dawn, could feel the invisible net around them. Every touch, every choice, had to slip between threads of doctrine, custom, and superstition. Desire was not simply about two bodies. It was about dodging the gaze of God, the priest, and the village all at once. In such a world, the forbidden's touch was not the act itself. It was the freedom to love without counting the cost. In the dim kitchens and warm back rooms of medieval Europe, a second network of authority thrived, one that had little to do with bishops or lords. It was the realm of the midwives, healers, and wise women. They were called upon for births, of course, but their work went far beyond cradling newborns. They knew the quiet remedies to bring on or delay a pregnancy, the herbs that soothed the laboring mother, the oils that eased a husband's ardor when the wife feared another child too soon. Their hands carried a library of knowledge, passed down not through parchment and ink, but through whispered instruction, through the pressure of a palm on another's wrist. Some of these practices were tolerated, so long as they served the church's ultimate aim, healthy children to fill the pews and fields. Others walked a perilous line. The use of pennyroyal, rue, or savory to bring on a late moon might be seen as ordinary household medicine by one neighbor and as a sin, even a form of murder, by another. Midwives were often the only ones who understood the female body in ways that men, even physicians, could not. They knew how to recognize a breached baby, how to turn it with a firm hand inside the womb, how to bind a mother's belly to help her heal. They understood the patterns of fertility, reading the signs in a woman's complexion, her monthly bleeding, the way her breasts felt in certain seasons of her life. Yet their position was precarious. The church relied on them for baptizing infants in emergencies, a role that gave them spiritual authority. But the same church also feared their autonomy. Manuals for inquisitors warned that some midwives conspired with the devil to steal newborns or prevent conception, an accusation that could see a woman tried for witchcraft. In villages, midwives were confidants as much as healers. A young bride might visit one to ask how to endure her husband's advances without conceiving. A widow might seek a charm to ensure her lover's fidelity. These exchanges were bound by a kind of silent oath. To betray a woman's secrets was to fracture the fragile trust that kept the community functioning. Margot had met the village midwife, a stooped woman named Berta, once before her marriage. Berta had spoken in riddles, offering a sprig of rosemary for courage and a cup of bitter tea that Margot had drunk without asking what it did. Now, as she lay in her new husband's bed, she thought of Berta's knowing eyes. Did the old woman sense her fears? Did she guess at the things Margot dared not speak aloud? Knowledge, in this hidden network, was a kind of resistance. It allowed women to navigate a world where their bodies were public property in the eyes of law, church, and husband. And for midwives, that knowledge was both a shield and a noose. One whisper of witchcraft, and the healer could become the accused. In such a world, every birth was a miracle, every prevention a crime, and the women who walked that narrow path lived in a constant negotiation between care and danger. The confessional was meant to be a place of the soul, a narrow, dark space where sins were whispered and absolution granted. But for married couples in the Middle Ages, it was also a place where the priest could reach, indirectly, into the bedchamber itself. The church taught that lust, even within marriage, was a dangerous fire. Sex was permitted for the sake of children, yes, but the enjoyment of it, the heat, the hunger, was to be approached with suspicion. Priests were trained to probe their parishioners' consciences with intimate, sometimes startlingly specific questions. A wife might be asked, "Do you consent to your husband's embrace willingly, or do you inflame him with words and touches?" A husband might be asked, "Do you come to your wife in lawful times, or in seasons forbidden by the church?" Behind the wooden lattice, these questions could strip away the last shreds of privacy. A penitent could be ordered to refrain from intimacy for a set number of days, to perform penance for using certain positions, or to abstain entirely until a holy feast had passed. And because confession was annual at minimum, and sometimes more frequent, the priest as voice became a recurring presence in the rhythms of a couple as marriage. Not every confessor was stern. Some, especially in smaller parishes, took a gentler approach, offering discreet advice to help couples balance duty with affection. Others used the confessional as a tool of power, binding parishioners to obedience with threats of public penance or denial of communion. There were darker stories still, of priests who exploited the vulnerability of the confessional to extract favors, or to sow suspicion between husband and wife. A poorly chosen question could plant a seed of doubt. Why would he ask me about that, unless my spouse had told him something? Margot had sat in the confessional only twice before her wedding. Both times she had knelt in the shadowed box, heart thudding as the priest's voice slid through the screen. He had asked about her thoughts, her dreams, whether she had ever touched herself in a way that tempted the flesh. She had mumbled denials, unsure whether to be more afraid of lying or of telling the truth. Now, as a married woman, she knew those questions would change. They would reach into her nights with Henrik, into the way she moved and breathed under his weight. And whatever she said in that dark booth would not be hers alone. It would be shaped, judged, and sometimes punished. In this way, the confessional was not just a place of forgiveness. It was a silent witness to every bed in the parish, a ledger of desire, guilt, and obedience kept in the mind of the man behind the screen. In the Middle Ages, the private became public with alarming ease. When whispers of sin reached the wrong ears, the bedroom could be dragged into the open air of a church court or a manorial hall, a place where every detail was picked apart like a carcass on a butcher's table. Adultery was among the most common charges, and not only for women. Husbands, too, could be hauled before the ecclesiastical judge if they strayed. But the weight of shame and the consequences often fell heaviest on wives. A woman found guilty could face fines, penance, or social ruin. In some regions, she might be paraded through the streets in nothing but a shift, holding a candle, her hair loose, as a sign of disgrace. Then there were cases of impotence trials, humiliating ordeals in which a man accused of being unable to consummate his marriage might be subjected to physical examination. Sometimes, the court appointed a panel of matrons to inspect him. In more sensational cases, the couple was ordered to attempt the act in front of witnesses, though this was rare and often more rumor than reality. Still, the threat of such exposure was enough to make these proceedings infamous. The charge of sins against nature could drag even more intimate details into the light. Deviations from the sanctioned missionary position, same-sex encounters, or acts deemed non-procreative could all be prosecuted. Witnesses might be neighbors who claimed to have heard suspicious sounds, seen someone leaving a home at odd hours, or most damning servants who testified to what they observed while working in the household. Church courts didn't operate in isolation. Gossip was both the fuel and the aftermath of these trials. A hearing might take place before only a handful of officials, but by the time the accused left the building, the story would already be winding its way through the taverns, marketplaces, and laundry yards. Details grew, shifted, and took on a life of their own. For Margot, even hearing such stories was enough to make her stomach twist. She knew that if her marriage ever became a matter for the court, her body, her words, and even her silences could be turned into evidence. A half-remembered evening, an overheard sigh, a servant's misunderstanding, any of it could become the foundation of public humiliation. In such trials, the verdict was rarely the end. The stain on one's name could linger for a lifetime, passed down in whispers to the next generation. A family might recover wealth, but never quite scrub away the memory of having stood accused in a matter of the flesh. Here, the court was not just a place of law. It was a theater, and the audience was the entire village. In the medieval world, widowhood was a curious crossroads. For the first time since girlhood, a woman might find herself without a man's direct authority over her body or her household. And yet, this freedom was never unqualified. It was watched, judged, and in some cases, punished. Legally, widows occupied a unique position. They could inherit land or goods from their late husbands, manage estates, and conduct business in their own names. A wealthy widow might wield more economic power than many men in her village. Some even chose not to remarry precisely to keep control of their property. Marriage, after all, would place everything back under a husband's hand. But with freedom came suspicion. The church and community alike saw a widow's ungoverned sexuality as dangerous. A woman past the first grief was expected to show modesty, restraint, and above all, chastity, unless she took another husband. Too much joy in her independence, too quick a return to bright clothing or public laughter, could set tongues wagging. Desire in a widow was often painted as greed. Greed for pleasure, for influence, for wealth. Older sermons warned that widows were like tinder, quick to ignite without the dampening presence of a spouse. Certain penitential manuals even advised widows to avoid living near unmarried men, lest temptation arise. And yet, many remarriages were swift, sometimes within months of a husband's death. Survival played a role. A widow without substantial means risked poverty, especially if her late husband's kin claimed the bulk of the inheritance. A new marriage could protect her, but it could also bind her to alliances she might not have chosen freely. There were darker terms, too. A widow accused of being too familiar with a man could face fines or penance, especially if the liaison produced a child. Illegitimate offspring threatened inheritance lines, and families could be ruthless in defending their claims. Margot had seen both faces of widowhood in her village, the sharp-eyed, silver-haired Lean, who ran her late husband's brewery with a firm hand and never once spoke of remarrying, and young Cav, married at 16, widowed at 17, whose beauty became a curse when 3 different men and their families fought over her. For a widow, longing itself could be costly. A single misstep might see her wealth stripped, her name blackened, or her body bound once more to a man she neither loved nor trusted. In the ledger of medieval morality, a widowess desire was always a line written in ink too dark to fade and too easy for others to read aloud.